All right there, guys. Good afternoon. How's it going? We just have about 2 minutes before we get started, but good to be with you as usual, and feel free to leave any kind of comment. Hi, Tina. Good to see you there. How's it going? Alicia, welcome back. Hey, Derek. Good to see you too. Just gonna put a little water over here in this hyper flask. We'll be right back. Kevin, Angela, Emily, how's it going? Good to see everybody. Hey, David. Moises, Diego, welcome back. Isabella, good afternoon. Yeah, been having a pretty good day so far. It's always nice to get to this class period here because this is my last meeting of the day, so kind of feel a little less pressure. When you're waking up in the morning, you have a set of things to do. I feel a little bit more at ease once I'm closer to the end. That's just me, but yeah. Welcome back. Hi, Angelina, Annalie. Okay, so here we go. It's pretty much now 2:30, so let us begin. Thanks as usual for your attendance and everything that you've done this semester. Make sure to leave behind some type of comment so that I can keep track of your attendance, and do continue to attend faithfully to the class. I think we've had pretty solid numbers throughout the semester, but sometimes as we get later into the term, people will, there's a little bit of attrition. Sometimes people find it harder to attend reliably at the end, but if you're watching this live or whether you're watching it delayed, make sure to try and keep coming to these meetings and, pick up the pace at the end, I think. That's the way I look at it. Sprint to the finish rather than kind of just limp to the finish. Okay, so good to be with you guys. Let's just figure out what we're doing now. We've reached a new topic in the semester. We spent a little time on time just now, and we finished that. So that brings us to another subject in the semester. So today we have kind of another transitional meeting where we're going into a new unit of the course. To begin the class, we studied philosophy of religion, questions about the existence of God and the nature of God. After that, we looked at ethics, having to do with morality and moral concepts, the theory of utilitarianism, the theory of Kantianism, as applied to certain topics too, like the trolley problem or economic inequality globally. Then we looked at the world of epistemology and the theory of knowledge. What is knowledge? What are the component parts of it? What is the difference between real knowledge and just guessing and getting it right? That talked to us about the work of Plato and later on Gettier, and also to some degree Descartes, who we'll talk about today. And now we have just wrapped up the unit on time and the metaphysics of time. What is time? What is the modern day scientific understanding of it? How is that different from earlier historical understandings of time? What is Einstein's contribution? What is the idea of space-time theory, and what revisions does that force upon us if we think that there's only the present moment and stuff like that? So now we continue with another important topic in philosophy, and this is the philosophy of mind. Okay, so that's where we're starting today, and this will be our subject for a couple of weeks to come, philosophy of mind. So first of all, let's try and all set the table for what is the philosophy of mind and what is this subject about. Philosophy of mind is simply the philosophical study of consciousness. So it's the study of consciousness Okay, so let's hang and talk for a minute about consciousness. Consciousness, what is that? Okay, does this marker have it? No. Do you and me have it? Yes. So we can see there's differences between things that are conscious beings, sentient, living, conscious things, and then just random objects, inanimate objects, things that can't think, feel, perceive, feel pain or pleasure, or have introspection. Okay, so consciousness is just the mental world, the ideas, feelings, thoughts that a being has when it's a conscious being. It covers a wide range of conscious states: pleasure, pain, laughter, fear, hope, desire. Whenever you're having any experience whatsoever, whether it's hunger, whether it's anxiety, depression, joy, these are conscious states. And we are conscious beings. Again, not like the table or chair that I'm sitting in. There are other conscious beings. There are other things that have consciousness too, non-human animals and other life forms on this planet. But consciousness is an amazing and interesting thing. Imagine if this universe never had consciousness in it. Imagine if after the Big Bang, there's just a bunch of matter and it's just sitting there, turning into stars and planets, but nothing lives and nothing thinks and nothing perceives any of it. That very well, I guess, could have happened according to a scientific account of the universe, which says that mankind was not there in the beginning. We just somehow evolved on this planet. But imagine if there was no Earth and there was just a bunch of dead space and matter. It would not be quite as interesting, I guess. So we are conscious beings. And as much as we like to study all the things outside of us, we also want to study what consciousness is itself. What is consciousness and what's the basic nature and essence of it? So this leads us into some very deep and interesting questions. So I'll try and pose to you what are some of the big questions that are within the philosophy of mind. Okay. But again, consciousness in general, it's the mental life. It's the ability to introspect, feel, imagine, hope, dream, and so on. Consciousness. So here are some of the big questions that philosophers and scientists are interested in on the concept of consciousness. So one is this. Are the mind and the brain the same thing, or are they two different things? So okay, so the mind and the brain, are they two things or are they the same thing? All right, now the brain. The brain, as you guys I'm sure know, is, according to science, the seat of consciousness. This is where all of our cognitive and mental activity happens, according to science, right? So we have different areas of the brain that deal with different aspects of our consciousness. And neuroscience has come to learn a lot about the functioning of different neurotransmitters and synapses in the brain that give rise to different mental phenomena. The use of, for example, drugs can cause psychoactive effects on the brain because of certain dopamine receptor sites that we have in the brain, and that's pretty well understood scientifically and physically. But the question is this: is the brain all there is to our mind? Is our mind really just that spongy matter inside of our skull? Is the mind the same thing as the brain by a different name? Or is the mind something that is different from the brain? Like some people, of course, believe in the afterlife and believe in the soul. And if you believe that you could have an afterlife, that means that you think consciousness is not altogether all about the brain. Because dust to dust, right? I mean, a brain after death decomposes and it's a skeleton eventually. So there's no brain anywhere at that point in time. So if the mind and the brain are the same, then that would mean consciousness cannot survive the death of the body. But some people, of course, believe that the mind is something separated, or at least separable from the physical body and the brain itself. So we'll entertain those different positions and try and answer the question, or at least learn about the arguments. Some people think the mind and the brain are one and the same, so there's no such thing as a non-physical spirit or soul. But other people think that there are two different things. The brain and then separate from that, the mind, which in principle can exist without the body even. Okay, so that's a question. Are the mind and the brain the same, or are they distinct? And kind of related to this question, a second one. Could consciousness be explained physically? Can consciousness, this thing that we have, that we're experiencing while you perceive me talking to you and I perceive myself addressing you, could this conscious experience just be all physical facts or not? So could consciousness be explained physically? Could it be explained physically? Some people will say yes, like the people I was kind of hinting at that say the mind and the brain are the same thing. They will say, well, even if we don't understand everything about how the brain works today or how it's responsible for the consciousness that we experience, we know that that, some would argue, is a physical thing. And ultimately, the explanation of it in physical terms is partial, and it's going to be filled in later as we continue to learn more about the neuroscience of the brain. But some people will say, no, consciousness is something a little more mysterious than what you could just learn about through studying science and physics. Maybe there's something about it that defies a physical analysis, that resists a purely reductive physical analysis. So some people will say that it's too rich. The subjective point of view that you have with consciousness, it's not going to be capable of being explained just on the basis of neurons and synapses firing in the brain. Maybe there's something more metaphysical going on, and it's not just all based on matter and the laws of physics. So another debated question, could it be explained physically? Some say yes, but others don't think so. And we'll learn about both sides of that argument. And then one more topic question along the same lines of philosophy of mind. Another interesting question is this one. Could a machine ever have consciousness, or could a machine ever think? I know I'm getting a little low on the board here, guys, but I'm just writing the word consciousness there, question mark. Can we read it? If not, I'm going to read it to you. Question is this, third question. Could a machine ever have consciousness? So, like you guys, maybe some of you, I'm sure, have watched enough science fiction that you know that people talk about the possibility of a future society where we have robots and androids and cyborgs that are like conscious beings. Okay, there's been so many movies about iRobot with Will Smith and all kinds of other examples, the HAL 9000 from Space Odyssey 2001. Anyway, so the question then is that, yeah, could a machine ever have consciousness? Some people think so. We'll read at least one author who argues yes. The inventor of the computer, the inventor of the digital computer is Alan Turing. And in 1950, he published an article called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And he argues there in a kind of visionary way, because it's 1950, back when machines and computers that did computing were very primitive, obviously, compared to what we have now 71 years later. But in 1950, he said that it's just a matter of time. In the future, someday machines will have consciousness. The only thing he thinks that's stopping it so far is just technological limits of storage capacity and processing power. But he thought that at some future time, there will be thinking machines. Now, other people, though, don't agree with that this is even possible. Like, some people will say that no matter what we ever build, even if it's imitating human conscious behavior down to the last detail, it won't be real consciousness. So it'll just be like a machine that, you know, has input and output conditions. Given a certain input, it will exhibit a certain behavioral output, but there's nothing that it's thinking or feeling inside. So, you know, you might have a viewpoint on that. We have a lot of chat bots and sort of voice assistants today, whether it was Alexa or, I don't want to say the name of the other one because I'm using an Apple product and then it'll turn it on. But yeah, those kind of things, could they ever evolve through future computing and artificial intelligence technology to be like full-on friends that we hang out with and that we talk to and that we share our thoughts with, that we regard as conscious beings like us? Or will that always be like a purely artificial simulation with no real consciousness because it's not like a biological life form, it's an item of human technology? Okay, so questions about the mind and consciousness. Is it physical? Is it not physical? Could a machine ever have it? Yes, no. This is our kind of lay of the land and the scope of what we will now talk about for a couple of weeks going forward. So just getting us set up on this new topic, philosophy of mind, and some of the big questions that we will pursue. Will we be able to answer these questions? I don't know. We're just going to hear arguments to try and give different answers, and then you will make your own decisions, what you thought were the best arguments, as usual. So now there's a couple of major positions in the world of philosophy of mind, and I'm going to talk to you guys about the two main positions. Okay, so two main positions in the philosophy of mind. Positions, views, schools of thought or whatever. Two main positions in the philosophy of mind. Okay, so science is called monism. And a different view besides that is what's called dualism. So let me talk about those. First of all, monism. Monism says that everything in the whole universe is all made out of the one kind of substance. Okay, so everything in this whole universe is made out of, built out of, composed out of one kind of substance. Monism. Okay, that's the idea. You see the definition. What it says is that according to this view, everything in the whole universe is just made out of one kind of substance. So there's only one fundamental type of thing that builds everything else. Only one substance is the basic building block of all objects and events in the universe. Dualism, in contrast, says that everything in the universe is not made out of just one, but out of two kinds of substances. So just a point about the wording. Monism contains the root mono, which means one. And that we see that in a lot of other words, like monogamy is to have one partner. Monotheism is to believe in one God. Mono speakers are just having one audio channel rather than two. So anyway, monism draws on that root meaning of one, claiming that everything in the universe is made out of one kind of substance. Now, dualism, as you can see, has the root of duo, meaning two. Like, look at this iconic duo, two things, two people. So it means two. So anyway, everything in the universe is made out of two kinds of substance. Dualism. Okay, so now what I need to tell you guys about are what are these so-called substances that are being discussed on either side of this debate. Okay, so the two eligible substances are these, matter and mind. So I'm going to write the definition of matter and mind up here, and then we're going to have a little further comment on how that applies to these two terms. So, okay. Okay, so this is like separate from these definitions, but we'll come back to them in a moment. So substances. One is matter, physical matter. And then the other one is mind. And let's make sure we all have the clear, same understanding here. So physical matter, this substance, what that refers to is just anything that is extended in space. Okay, so physical matter is extended in space, meaning that it takes up some space. It occupies and has some mass and volume and shape in space. So that's physical matter. Anything that is extended in space. And I have a question for you guys. Anything that is extended in space, and I'm going to put here in parenthesis what the most tiny unit of matter is. Who thinks they know about that? What word is in your vocabulary if I ask you what's the smallest particle of matter that you can that you can talk about. So you break down matter further and further and further. When you get to the smallest piece that you can't break down anymore, they call those what? The atom. That's right, Alicia. Now, Derek, fair enough. I know that you must have a little bit background knowledge of physics, and they say in physics that there are subatomic particles like quarks. But let me just go with atom because it is the classical term for the least unit of matter. Actually, if you go all the way back to ancient Greece, atom was first discussed by the philosopher Democritus, and he uses the word atom, which means in Greek not cuttable, cannot be cut. So even though today we talk about the subatomic particles, let's just use the generic phrase atom to refer to whatever it is that is the tiniest unit of matter. So anyway, here I put atoms. Anything that's extended in space and at the bottom level, that's atoms. Now, the other possible substance, not in physical matter, but mind, in the philosophical usage of the term mind, it's not to be confused with the brain, because the brain is something that is extended in space. You know, it's right there in my head and in yours, and it takes up a little room, and it's got some volume and some mass and some shape. So the brain is a physical thing, but the mind, in terms of this debate between monism and dualism, is more like the idea of the soul. So it's something that is not extended in space. It has no size. It's not like a tiny little pebble or something. It's just nowhere in space. Literally has no size, shape, mass, or anything. But yet it's thinking. So it's like a purely disembodied consciousness. It's like consciousness with no physical structure to it. So mind, not extended in space. And is thinking. Okay, so all I'm writing here, I can tell it's a little compressed, but you can hear me say it. Mind, definition, not extended in space and is thinking. Okay, so now that we have discussed the different possible substances here, we can come back to these and I'll inform you about two branches of monism. Okay, so what is monism again? It says that there's only one substance that makes everything. But which one? Well, there's two options. And because of that, there's two kinds of monism. Okay, so let me now break this down into two subcategories. One version of monism is what is called physicalism, physicalist monism. So here's what the physicalism position says under monism. It says that everything in the whole universe is made out of this kind of substance, physical matter, including us and our consciousness. So that's the idea. Physicalism. Everything in the universe is made out of physical matter. Everything in the universe is made out of physical matter. And this is key, one last little part of it, including us and our consciousness. Physicalism, one branch of monism, which says this, that everything in the universe is made out of that substance. It's all made out of matter, and that even includes us and our consciousness. So on the physicalist version of monism, everything's physical. Everything's a physical object. There's no such thing as something that is not physical. So to the physicalist, 100% of everything is just made out of atoms. And so your ability to think right now, and my ability to perceive and think also, is really just the playing out of atoms that are bundled together to form the brain. And that brain, has its ability to perceive its environment and to judge things and to think about things. But that brain is not anything spiritual. It's not some kind of ghost in the machine. It's not some kind of disembodied, consciousness that could survive the death of the brain. So if you're a physicalist, you believe that consciousness is completely 100% a physical phenomenon happening with the physical brain that's made out of atoms. So what is an object on physicalism? It's a bundle of atoms put together a certain way. See my hydro flask? I'm really enjoying it, by the way. I've just recently been given it as a gift. This thing is just a bunch of atoms bundled together flask-wise, and they combine to create that thing. And me talking to you, I'm just a big bunch of atoms put together human being wise, and it leads to the existence of the thing that I am that can talk to you. But even though I'm a conscious being and this is an unconscious inanimate object, we are still both made out of atoms of various kinds just combined. So that's how physicalism sees the world. We're all just made out of atoms. There's nothing that's non-physical. Your consciousness is a physical byproduct of the brain, and therefore, according to physicalism, there's no possibility for like the afterlife, because if there's no functioning brain, then consciousness could not exist, because it's merely a product of the physical brain and its electrochemical signals and neurochemistry. So you understand that, like on a physicalist position, once the brain is gone and a person's decomposed, there's nothing there that could generate their consciousness, and so it's not like their consciousness could be somehow floating free away from the body. That's physicalism. Okay, that's one view. That's one kind of monism. The other one, and I don't want to take much time on this other one because let me just tell you for real, it's not very popular anymore. There's very, very few people who take it seriously in the modern day, but it had a run of popularity a couple centuries back, and this is what's called idealism. That's another version of monism. What idealism says is like that everything's made out of just thoughts instead of matter. So how weird is that? On idealism, everything in the universe is made out of ideas. So there's actually no physical matter. This table, this flask, this computing device, all this stuff around you is just thoughts. So there's like no real solid matter. That's an illusion. What you're looking at are ideas. So that's idealism. Everything in the universe is made out of ideas. Sorry for the little compressed notes there, but I'm going to just say it also so that there's no ambiguity or confusion. It says here, definition of idealism, that everything in the universe is made out of ideas rather than matter. So if idealism is true, then everything around us is just thoughts. They're just all thoughts and ideas. Now you might be wondering, if that's true, then what happens to the things when I'm not thinking about them or no one's there? Because if they're thoughts, right, and no one's having the thought, then I guess the thing is not objective, it's subjective, right? Well, the most sophisticated presentations of idealism say that when no particular person is thinking of the thing, God is the thinker. So things kind of maintain some independence from our particular perception by God being like the master perceiver of everything. So God kind of keeps the moon existing even when no one's looking at it during the daytime or whatever, because he keeps thinking about it. But anyway, look, the real debate that we are going to focus on is the debate between these two positions, physicalism and dualism. So idealism is mentioned right now, but it's just to kind of give you the full menu of possibilities. For our purposes in this class, we will now set idealism aside for the most part, just knowing what it is. Now we can set it aside, and we're really going to be mostly looking at this. Who's correct, physicalist monism or dualism? Okay, so now dualism says there's both substances. To the dualist, it's not just everything's matter or everything is mind, but rather they say there's both. There's matter and there's mind. So according to dualism, yes, there's atoms that aggregate to form all the objects that we see and even our body. But aside from that, if you're a dualist, you believe there's also this non-physical mind. The consciousness that you have is not a physical object, and it's not merely the brain. So according to dualism, there's some kind of connection between the mind or soul, whatever it is, and the body. But they're not the same thing, and they can and they will be distinguished if, for example, your body dies and your consciousness survives through the afterlife. So the dualism is the one that holds the possibility of consciousness existing in a disembodied state after the body is gone. But on physicalism, everything's made out of matter. So if you don't have the physical matter that can support consciousness, then there can't be consciousness. Okay. So we will now pursue these questions. Is the brain and the mind the same thing, or are they distinct? Can consciousness be explained physically or no? Could a machine ever have consciousness? Maybe, maybe not. And we'll look at all the different views on all these questions. So now that we've got the sort of stage set, you know that we're talking about philosophy of mind. You know that we're going to compare against physicalist monism and dualism. Now we will get into the arguments. So we're going to study arguments from people that are both dualists and physicalists. And we're starting today with the dualist position. Okay, so our author that's going to try to convince you that dualism is true is Rene Descartes. So we're back to Rene Descartes. We studied him one earlier time in this class. When we were reading about epistemology, we learned about his classic book, The Meditations, chapter 1 and 2. Now we are going to come back to that same book, and we're looking at chapter 6, Meditation 6. So just a quick reminder about his name and his identity. This is Rene Descartes. The French philosopher who lived from 1596 until 1650, and who wrote in 1641 his classic, The Meditations, or the full title, Meditations on First Philosophy. As I've said, this is a book that has 6 chapters in it, and the chapters are listed as Meditations 1 through 6. So as we've already read Meditation 1 and 2, now we're looking at Meditation 6, the 6th and final chapter of his book. And this is where he gives us his full argument for dualism. Okay. Now I'm going to write the whole argument up here and try to make it as clear as I possibly can. But just to sort of give you a big preview of what it will say, here's the big overall gist. He's going to say that it's because we can clearly imagine our mind and our body existing separately from each other. Since that is clearly conceivable, imaginable, then they must really be able to be separated. So it's based on conceivability. He thinks it is so obvious and clear for you to imagine your mind existing without the body being there. And since he thinks we can imagine this, it must be that they really are separate. Okay, so since we can think of it being separate, it really is separate. But that's a very big oversimplification. So we're going to get into the details from here. All right, so I'm going to erase just author and text and dates, and now we'll get into the argument itself. So how is this guy going to try to show that the mind and the body are two separate things and they're not the same? Okay. Descartes' argument for dualism. I'll just put this as the header. Okay. Now, in logic and philosophy, and I think we've kind of touched on this briefly before, sometimes when you have detailed arguments, they're listed with a set of premises that are given, which lead to a conclusion. And the conclusion of the argument is the claim that you're trying to prove. And the premises that you give are supposed to be the reasons or the evidence that leads to the conclusion. Okay, so oftentimes the premises are numbered and placed in a list, and we see the full list of them that leads to our conclusion below. So we're going to show this argument. There's many premises. It's a pretty detailed argument, and so it'll take me a while to spell the whole thing out, but I'll walk you through it. Just know this, too, that as you read the chapter from our textbook on this, some of the information contained in the full argument is only indirectly referred to in the writing because some of it has to do with information that was found in the intervening chapters between 2 and 6. That's 3, 4, and 5. So since he has some scattered and indirect references to that content, I'm going to try and make it a little bit more specific and clear in the way I present the argument here. Okay, so first premise of Descartes' argument, guys, refers back to the method of doubt. And it says that based on the method of doubt, I'm able to doubt everything that I perceive with my 5 senses, and even math and logic. Okay, so based on the method of doubt, which was discussed in prior meditations, I am able to doubt everything perceived by the 5 senses. The 5 senses, and even math and logic. Okay, so let me explain, and once I've provided a premise, a part of the argument, I'll try to discuss it with you. So remember the method of doubt. The method of doubt was what Descartes said we should use to determine what is certain. And what does the method say to do? It says that if something can be doubted, even if it's not very likely that it's false, but even just that it could be doubted, we will go ahead and assume that it is false. Okay, so if there's even a very, very remote possibility that it's false, let's go ahead and say so. And we'll do this until we find something that we can't doubt. Now, with this method being applied, he says we can doubt everything that we've perceived through the five senses. Does anybody remember why he said that? Why did Mr. Descartes say that everything that you see, taste, touch, hear, and smell could be false? How so? Just touching base with you. Have a couple questions at times. Maybe you'll remember this. Why did he say that you can doubt everything from your five senses? That's right, isn't it, Spencer, that we could be dreaming? Yeah, so we could be dreaming. Maybe right now you're dreaming. Who knows? I mean, you don't think so, but if you've been dreaming the whole time, then you wouldn't be able to really tell the difference, right? So he says, okay, the method of doubt rules out all the things we perceive through the five senses. Let me tell you something that's funny. Last night I actually had a dream. It was a weird dream. It was like at one of the schools where I teach, I was a professor, but I was also a student again somehow in a weird way. And one of my chairs, like in the department, like, you know, basically the boss of the department where I work, they asked me to submit some work to them like a student, and I turned it in and I got an F. And I was freaked out in the dream, like, how am I getting an F? I'm a professor now, and it didn't make sense. But anyway, I thought it was really happening. Then I woke up and I was like, sweet, that was all fake. So what if this is like a dream and everything you're experiencing is fake, and someday you'll wake up and be like, what was that? Okay, so understand that it's possible for you to think that something's real, but it's just a big illusion. Even math and logic, he said, could be doubted because maybe there's an external deceiver, like a mad scientist, evil demon type of figure who's manipulating those thoughts as well. So all bets are off when it comes to five senses and math and logic. But one thing is certain. Can we remember that? He says, despite all of this doubt, I know something for sure. Even the method of doubt could not make me doubt this. What's the one thing he says that survives through the method? The thing that you cannot doubt, that you can totally take for certainty, is what thing? You'll tell me. What's that little extra one thing that he says, yes, this is something that cannot be doubted? Because it wouldn't even make sense to doubt it if you think about it. It's the certain knowledge that what? Yeah, just let me know. Okay, that you say, Alicia, your mind or consciousness exists. That you exist, at least as a conscious mind, if not as a body, for the basic fact that you are thinking. Okay, good. So despite this, second premise. Despite this, I know for certain that I exist, at least as a mind. At least as a non-physical mind, because again, the body and the way its appearance and shape and size is subject to the doubts about perception too. So despite all of the other things, I know for certain that I exist at least as a non-physical mind, if not a body, because why? Because I am thinking. Okay, so based on method of doubt, I can doubt everything from the five senses, even mathematical. But despite all that, I do know for certain that I exist, at least as a non-physical mind, because I'm thinking. Okay, so the first couple of opening steps of this argument. Step one, all kinds of stuff can be doubted because of this method. Step two, but one thing is certain, your own existence, at least as a mind, because of the fact that you're thinking. Okay, so where does he go next? The next thing he says is this. Since you're a mind, if nothing else, I mean, you're definitely at least a mind because you are thinking. So let's hold on to that. You know your mind, what's in the mind are ideas. So he says, in my mind there are ideas, but one of them he calls out and singles out for special attention because he thinks it's unique. And it's the idea of, what do you think? Is this one unique idea that he thinks is different from all the others? I don't know if you would have guessed it. Maybe it's a surprise, maybe it's not. But he says we have this one idea that's very special, and it's the idea of God. Okay, so he says, in my mind, which I know at least exists, there are ideas. Okay, including the idea of God. Okay, so all we have so far is that Almost everything is subject to doubt except the knowledge that your mind exists because you're thinking. And if we zoom into what's in that mind, we'll see that there are ideas. And one of those ideas is the idea of God. Now, what about that idea of God? That's his next point. He says this idea of God is unique, it's special, it's different, it stands alone because of all the ideas that you have in your mind. It's the one and only idea of something that is infinite. So he says the idea of God, this idea is special, it's unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Okay? This idea of God is unique because it is the idea of an infinite being. Okay, unique. Why? Because it's the idea of an infinite being. So think of anything else besides God. Aside from God, everything else you could think of is something that has limits, that's temporary, that's finite, okay? And so, like, if you're thinking of me, you're thinking of a human being who, lives and dies and, bleeds, and so I have limits. I'm not, like, obviously unlimited. But if you think of something bigger, like a mountain, okay, well, that's going to last a lot longer than a person. But still, the mountain hasn't always been there because the planet Earth has not always existed. And the mountain won't always be there because eventually this whole solar system will be destroyed when the sun explodes. So all the things you can think about, the sun itself, as long as it's been there and as long-standing and durable as it is, all these suns eventually, all these stars eventually exhaust their fuel and then they supernova. So the whole universe itself, as we've heard from science and cosmology, is something that they believe started at a particular point in time. From the Big Bang, or if you believe in creation, from creation. So everything that you can think of, whether it's big, small, is still something that's temporary and limited. But the idea of God, he says, that's different. That's the one thing that you can think of that's the idea of something unlimited, infinite, eternal, and all of the rest. So what about the idea of God and the fact that it's infinite? So what? So this takes us to the next step of the argument. Now, if I had a full whiteboard, obviously, I would just continue listing these down vertically until we got to the bottom line. But since I obviously have limitations of space, the board is finite too, isn't it? Then I'll clear it away and we'll continue at the top. So to premise 5 next. I'm erasing to create space for premise 5. Okay, so yeah, so it says I have this unique idea of God because it's the idea of an infinite being. What follows after that? Well, he says this. This is an important step in his argument, so let me take some time to really make sure it comes through clearly. He says this idea of God is the idea of an infinite being. And in his view, since the idea of God is an infinite idea, it has to come from something that is also infinite. Okay, so let me write this. Since the idea of God is the idea of an infinite being, it must be caused by something that has infinite reality. Okay, so since the idea of God is the idea of an infinite being, it must be caused by something that has infinite reality. I know that might look a little bit weird and obscure at first, but I think I can make it seem pretty straightforward, okay? When I was a student in college, way back in the day at UCLA, I had a professor teaching me this stuff, and he had an example here that I thought was helpful, so I'm going to try and give it to you too. All right. So look at this drawing. I'm just going to draw 2 containers, container A and container B. So suppose that this here is container B. It's looking like a boat, so let me just make it a little better. Container B, all right? And here above is container A. Now, I'm going to tell you about B. I'm telling you that container B has 1 gallon of water in it. 1 gallon. And also, I'm telling you something else, that this 1 gallon that's inside of container B was given to it from container A. So like A deposited these contents into B. A deposited the gallon into B. So very simple question, okay? Tell me, if A gave a gallon to B, then A has to be at least how big in terms of its storage space? Greater than or equal to what? So the storage capacity of A, by clear logic, has to be at least how big? Greater than or equal to how much size of A? Since we know that A gave a gallon to B, it's, David, your answer is, oh, you're saying B as in like the content, the quantity held in B. Yeah, right, 1 gallon. Very good. So I hope I didn't lose anybody with that, right? Obviously, A has to have at least the size to hold a gallon, because otherwise we'd be violating logic. It couldn't give a gallon if it says only capable of holding a half gallon. That would be like saying a half-gallon container has poured a gallon into something. It would not make sense. So this thing must be greater than or equal to 1 gallon. The content size of A. Is that fair? I hope that makes just perfect sense. Okay, so now, along the same lines, using an analogy, let's suppose that now A and B, well, let me just put it this way. You are B. B is you, and that's your mind. And what's one thing that's in your mind is the idea of God. And as he says, this idea of God is the idea of something that's what? Infinite. So that is my trying to draw the infinity symbol, the figure 8 turned on its side. So you have an idea of God that's an infinite idea. And he thinks this idea has to come from some source, right? It has to come from somewhere. So suppose that A is the thing that causes your idea of God. Since the idea contains infinite reality, how much reality does the cause have to have? Okay, so like if this is the cause of your idea of God, then this thing has to have at least how much reality to give that idea to you. Can you follow the analogy? So when it was water and B had a gallon, A had to have at least a gallon to give it. Now when I say that B is a mind that has an idea of God, which is an infinite idea, it must have to come from something that causes it, which is at least infinite. Because, correct, Tina, it wouldn't make sense, he thinks, for something finite to generate the idea of an infinite God. That does not make sense. You couldn't possibly come up with the idea of God just thinking about finite things. So he thinks, therefore, that whatever the cause of our idea of God is, has to be something that is at least infinite. Okay? Because nothing else could be the explanation for how this idea got into your mind. So if the cause of your idea of God is something that's at least infinite, then he thinks this means what? That actually God exists. God has to exist, he's saying, because if he didn't, then there would be no explanation for how you could get this idea of God in your mind. Or let me say it differently. The only available explanation for how this idea is in your mind, which he says it's there, and you have the idea at least of God, the only way you could have this idea is that there is a God to cause it, because nothing else is great enough to lead to the existence of this idea for you. So it's almost like a kind of spin on the ontological argument, if you will. Remember with Anselm, he said the idea of God is too great for him to not exist. I'm skipping several steps, obviously simplifying it a bit, but this is similar in the sense that he deduces God's existence from the basic fact that you have an idea of him, and the idea is so great and infinite that it has to really be caused by the infinite being himself. So anyway, according to that explanation I've given you, and the premise that you see here, the sixth premise is simply that therefore, so God exists. Okay, so a couple more steps then to complete his argument. Saying now that God exists, how does he arrive at that conclusion? Well, because we have an idea of God in mind, and he thinks that idea of being infinite could only be caused by something infinite, and the only infinite thing would be God, so he's the only possible cause. So premise 7 then continues from here by saying the following. So since God exists, which he thinks he's now proven during the argument, he believes that unlocks further moves from here. Since God exists and he is known to be perfectly good, in other words, omnibenevolent, this means that if you have clear and distinct perceptions, they're guaranteed to be true. They must be true. So let me write that here. Since God exists and is known to be infinitely good, omnibenevolent is the word that sometimes is used. Since God exists and he's known to be infinitely good, he is not a deceiver. Not a deceiver. Okay? So at any time, if any of this is confusing or you'd like clarification or something added, please let me know. I'm happy to help and explain. But here's where we are in the argument so far. Let's take stock and take it back to the beginning. Beginning at the start, he says, using the method of doubt, almost everything can be doubted. All things perceived by the senses, even math, so forth. One thing, though, can't be doubted, and that's the existence of your mind because of the fact that you are thinking. We'll hold off on the existence of the body for the time being, but at a minimum, you know you have a mind because you are thinking. Okay, so in the mind, you have ideas. One of those ideas he singles out because he thinks it's unique. It's the idea of God. Why is it unique? Because this is the idea of an infinite being. And as you can see, he thinks that since the idea of God is infinite, then it must be caused by something that is also infinite, and therefore God must exist to cause the idea. So since God exists, we can say that he's known to be infinitely good. And if he's infinitely good, he would not deceive us. So that's huge for him, because once he thinks he's got that on the table, that God exists and he's benevolent, so he would not deceive us, that leads to the 8th premise, which says that since God is not a deceiver, when I have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. Okay? Since God is not a deceiver, whenever I have clear and distinct perceptions, clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. Okay, so since God's not a deceiver, whenever I have clear and distinct perceptions, those must be true. Now, allow me to explain that a little bit. What he's saying here to you is this. God, as we know him, is infinitely good. He's, as others have said, the greatest conceivable being. Part of that greatness is to be perfectly good and righteous and just. So if he's perfectly good, then he's not going to deceive. If you're not a deceiver, that means that people like us, when we have clear and distinct perceptions, they have to be true. Because now consider this. If your clear and distinct perceptions were not true, then God would be deceiving you. So take for the sake of argument that right now you're dreaming and all of this is a big dream, it's all fake. If that was really true, then what would God be doing to you? He'd be creating you just so that you get everything wrong. He would be setting you up to be massively deceived, right? So that can't be false, because if it was, God would just be playing games with you, creating you in his image just so that you can live your whole life in a simulation, in the matrix, in a dream. I mean, that would be the opposite of being good. That would be trickery, that would be deception, that would be contradictory to his, infinite goodness. So the point is, if something's very clear and distinct, if we just naturally believe something and it's so obvious and so clear to us, then that has to be something that's really true, because it would not be consistent with God and his goodness for those things to turn out false, right? So God's goodness prevents us from being massively deceived about the things that are clear and distinct. So this is going to really give us, he thinks, the knowledge that we had temporarily set to the side with the method of doubt, because now we're armed with this new little quiver in our ammo, which is that if it's something clear and distinct, God would not want you to be wrong about that because he's too nice and he's too good. So clear and distinct perceptions, takeaway point, they've got to be true. Whatever's clear and distinct has to be true, and it's guaranteed by God to be true. Why? Because he's good, and he's not gonna deceive and trick us when things are that obvious. So we've reached almost the end of the argument. There's just 2 more steps. So I do have to clear the board one last time, and then we'll get to the last couple of statements of the argument. So let's move to that. The last premise, as you saw, number 8, just says that since God's not a deceiver, whenever I have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. So now, what are some of these clear and distinct perceptions? Descartes points out a few of them, but one of them that is relevant to this argument is this. He says, among my clear and distinct perceptions is the knowledge that if 2 things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately from each other, then those really are two separate things. Okay, so among my clear and distinct perceptions, is the knowledge that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, meaning they can clearly be imagined to exist separately. So if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then in that case, they really are two separate things. Okay, so among my clear and distinct perceptions, so among these, one of them is the knowledge that if two things can be clearly conceived of as existing separately, then that means that they really are two separate things. Let me make this point clear if I can, do some simple examples. So right now, as you can see, I have this watch on my wrist. So it's not separated from me, at least right now. It's attached to my body, on the wrist, on the arm. But I hope this doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination. But I want to ask you a basic question. Can you clearly conceive of me and this watch existing separately? Like, can you clearly imagine in your mind right now a possible scenario where me and this watch are just in two separate places and we're not attached? Is that possible? Is that clear? Can you clearly imagine that? Yay or nay? What do you think? So the watch is on my wrist. Can you clearly imagine me and the watch being separated? That's the only question. Surely you can, okay? I would hope this didn't provide any kind of difficult answer to you because, right, it's obvious that I could take the watch off. Do I really have to demonstrate that for you to be able to understand that it's clearly possible? I don't think so, but anyway, I'll do it anyway. So look, here's the watch. It's on the wrist. It's not going to be there long. Okay, now, watch is over there, and I'm here. So we're in two separate places. Look, it happened. We're separated. Now, I didn't need to have done that. I could have had that watch on my wrist for the whole rest of my life and never taken it off, and you would have still understood by just thinking that it's clearly conceivable for me and the watch to be separated, even if we didn't happen to do it. So because it's clearly imaginable, and I've even done it in reality, that means, don't you agree, that me and the watch are not the same thing? Since it's clearly conceivable for the watch to be separate from me, that means that I'm not the watch and the watch isn't me. The watch can exist without me. I can exist without the watch. And as you can see, we are actually doing that right now. So the point then is the following. If you can clearly imagine two things being separated, whether or not they're currently mingled together or attached, if you can just imagine them being separated, then they really are two different things. Furthermore, he says that because of God existing and the awesome, omnipotent, almighty power of God, if there are two things that you can imagine existing separately, even if it would be very difficult for us to separate them, if it's even within the realm of possibility, then God could do it for sure because he's got awesome and infinite power. So like take the case where I pour water, hot water into some salt or vice versa. Now it's salt water, right? And you might say, it's a little hard to disentangle the salt content from the water, but of course we could do that through desalinization, boil the water, salt content stays behind, let the water condense. And now, you know, that's how we would desalinize ocean water, for example. But the point again is that although it's kind of tough to take salt out of water, even the thought that it's possible at all means that they're not the same thing. And, you know, God, of course, wouldn't even have to go through a complicated process. He could just, you know, will it, and then the two things would be separated. So through my examples and illustrations here, I hope the point is coming into focus. This premise is just saying that because a person, or if a person can imagine two things existing separately, then they must be capable of existing separately. Therefore, they're not the same thing. Me and my glasses, me and my watch, etc., etc. Now, that takes us to the last two steps of the argument. So now, premise 10. What do you think he's going to say here? He says in premise 10 that these are two things that can clearly be imagined as existing separately. And this really gets us to the conclusion of dualism. So dualism says that the mind and the body are two different things. So what do you think is premise 10? He's going to say that I can clearly conceive of these two things existing separately. In fact, it's related to the earlier work of meditation 1 and 2, because if you imagine that it's possible for you to be dreaming all this, then you've already entertained the possible concept of this being separate from that. So what are these two very basic things that are relevant to our dualist topic that he thinks we can clearly imagine existing separately? You can clearly imagine your what existing without your what. Help me finish that, and then I'll write it on the board. I can clearly conceive of the blank and the blank existing separately. What do you think are those blank spaces? Rack your brain, think about it, but tell me what you think. Because we're only one step away from the conclusion, so maybe that'll help you as a hint. I can clearly imagine these two things existing separately, and what do you think I'm hinting at? Just awkward silence, that's it? Come on. The mind without the body. That's right, yes, Tina. But to the others, you guys can think about that, right? Mind without the body, because it's about dualism, right? The whole position is that the mind and the body are not the same, but they're two separate things. So yes, he does say that. I can clearly imagine, I can clearly conceive of my mind existing without my body. Separately from my body. So now we get to the bottom line. When you finish an argument in logic, oftentimes you see this format where there's a horizontal line and the conclusion is placed below. It reminds you a little of math, because in math, if you've ever done elementary like addition, sometimes you've seen this format. You have the factors that lead to the sum and the sum below. And so in logic, it's kind of like that, except we're working with statements rather than numbers. The statement here at bottom is supposed to be the product of all the factors that are listed above. And so now it's the conclusion. What do you think is the conclusion then? If it says that whenever two things can be understood existing separately, they really are separate, and I can clearly conceive of my mind existing separately from my body, the conclusion, therefore, is that the mind and the body are two separate things. In other words, dualism. So the mind and the body are two separate things. And that's it, voila. Dualism is the conclusion. Let's work backwards, and now that we have the full argument spelled out, I'll try and talk to you about it from both top to bottom and bottom to top. So working backwards, the conclusion is that the mind and the body are two separate things. Why? Well, because I can imagine them existing separately. But why should that show that they really are? Well, because God is so good that he guarantees that clear and distinct perceptions are true. And according to Descartes, it is a clear and distinct perception that whenever a person can imagine two things existing separately, then that means that they are actually two separate things, even if they happen to be connected for some time now or temporarily so. How do we know that God exists? Well, he says the knowledge that God exists comes from the idea that we have of God, which he does not think happened to have found its way into the mind any other way except for God having caused it. And how do I know I have ideas? Well, just because I'm thinking. And since I'm thinking, I know I exist, even if nothing else is certain. Now, from top to bottom, the method of doubt means that everything's subject to doubt except one basic thing, not sense perception, not math and logic, but just the knowledge that you're a thinking mind. Okay, in the mind you have ideas, including one of God. It's very special because it's the idea of something infinite. That idea couldn't come from anything else except for something infinite, so it had to be caused by the infinite being, which is God, so God exists. Since God exists and he's known to be perfectly good, he would not want to deceive. Therefore, when you have clear and distinct perceptions, they must be true. One of these clear and distinct perceptions is the certain knowledge that if two things could be imagined existing separately, then they're really two different things, and I can clearly conceive of my mind existing apart from my body. So therefore, it does follow that the mind and body are two different things. About number 10. He says, I can clearly conceive of my mind existing without my body. He thinks that we've already gone through that if we read Meditation 1 and 2, where we were told that maybe the world is a big dream that you're having. If the world could be a dream, then your body could be a dream too. And so your body's existence is subject to those doubts of the method of doubt. But the existence of your mind is not subject to doubt for as long as you're thinking. So it remains a possible thought that right now you're just a mind with no body. And since you can conceive of this possibility, they must be two different things, even if they happen to be attached or connected, like me and the watch, for some time period. Now, let me read a quote from Descartes here, and you'll hear his way of putting some of these points that I've listed in the full argument. So on page 556 on the left column, he says this: "First, I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God, so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Therefore, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. The question of what kind of power is required to cause such a separation does not affect the judgment that the two things are distinct. Therefore, simply by knowing that I exist, and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I can deduce correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. It is true that I may have a body that is very closely joined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body insofar as this is an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body, and I can't exist without it." Okay. So now don't misunderstand this 10th premise. When he says I can imagine my mind existing separately from my body, I hope none of you guys are filling your mind with like gory images of bodies blown apart with like a head in one place and a torso in another, because that's not the kind of separation we're talking about, because the head and brain is still part of the physical body. We're talking more about like the ghost leaving the body and all of the matter staying behind while the ghost goes off into the heavenly afterlife or whatever. Now, Descartes doesn't mention such cases as these because I don't think there was a lot of reporting or evidence of such things in that time. But you may have heard in pop culture about people that talk about like near-death experiences. I'm not trying to say I give credibility to these claims or not, but take it as an example. Someone says, "Oh, I got into a traumatic accident. I was flatlining in the ER, and I remember at one point teleporting out of my body and looking down and seeing the surgical team working on my body, and it was like I was in a different place." So the ability for you to be able to just think of such scenarios, according to Descartes, that justifies the certain knowledge that you can exist without your body, because God would not allow you to have this clear and distinct perception of the ability of the two things to be separated if they were not really distinct. Then in that case, God would be giving you this clear idea of your mind and body being able to exist separately, but it would be false, and that would contradict his benevolence. So that's how he thinks that we know dualism is true, because we can conceive of the mind and body existing without one another. And since we can imagine this, God gives the guarantee that they really are two different things. Now, for now anyway, your mind and body are connected. But in the ultimate event of death, God causes the two things to be separated at that time, according to Descartes' reasoning anyway. So this is an argument for dualism. Your mind, according to this argument, is not necessarily rooted in the body. It has a connection to it, but it can and will, I suppose, if this is correct, exist independently of the body once the body is fully destroyed through decomposition and becomes a skeleton eventually, and even less dust. So does this make some sense to you? I hope so. I mean, it's a long, convoluted argument, but you know, if you just look at each step and you take it piece by piece, it starts to kind of make sense by the time you get to the end. Now, there are a couple of other clear and distinct perceptions that he mentions also in addition to this, that dualism is true according to him. And I just thought I might be able to say a few things about those points before we close today. So, other clear and distinct perceptions that we can also, he thinks, now place trust in, because we've established the existence of God, who guarantees that these are true things. Other clear and distinct perceptions. Okay, so this is one. The external world exists. Now, if you remember back in the first two meditations, we were questioning this. Is there an external reality, or is it all just an illusion or a hologram or a matrix or something, a dream? Well, now Descartes says, actually, just kidding, it does exist. And why do I say this? Because it's clear and distinct, and God would not trick you about that. But what makes it so clear and distinct that the external world exists? He has a few things to even say to back this up. So he says, this is clear and distinct because, and I'll give you three reasons. Okay, number one, I cannot perceive only the things that I want to perceive. So I cannot perceive only that which is favorable to me. Okay. So, okay, if the world was a dream and there was no actual objective reality out there, so imagine that that's the case. If that was true, then wouldn't you think that you, the dreamer, would be able to shape it to your will just by having like thoughts and will? So obviously, though, that's not how it works. If this world was my dream, for example, and I'm the dreamer, then I would try to make things happen within it that are favorable to me. So like I would just like, I don't know, I would step outside of my house and I'd be like, there's a big bag of money right there, and I'm just gonna find it. And I would. And I would have somebody call me later today and be like, Dr. Vulich, I've looked at your YouTube videos, you're a genius, and so I'm gonna give you millions of dollars just so that you can do your own research and retire. I would love working and everything. I'm just making that up. Neither do I think I'm a genius. It's kind of a joke. But you understand, like if this world was like me creating it, I would make everything lined up for my own interests and to suit my desires. But that's not how it works. Do you really think that we would be in the middle of a pandemic if I was like the author of reality, kind of shaping it to my will? I don't prefer this. So certainly, if I had the world under my control because it's all my own subjective perception of things, then I would have a lot more favorable perception. I mean, my life's pretty good, you know, but when you lose things, when you experience loss, things that you wish didn't happen, you cry and you're suffering. If the world was a dream, then don't you think you'd somehow be able to eliminate or edit those things out just by choosing? But the fact that you can't do it shows you that that external reality, it's not subjective to you, it's objective because it doesn't depend on what you want. And so in a similar sense, that relates to the second reason that this is clear. It's also because I cannot control what I perceive. This is similar, but there's a little difference. So let me make a point here. So again, if there was no external reality, then you would think that you could just cause things to pop in and pop out of existence with your mind, but you cannot do that. So wherever you're at right now, I want you to like look at the ground right nearby to you, and I want you to look at that, and I just want you to see a platypus on the ground. Can you do that? Can you make yourself perceive a platypus? I already know the answer, and it's no. Now you might be thinking, oh yeah, I'm very creative, you know, I'm seeing it right now, but not really. Unless you're on certain kind of drugs or something, you're not going to actually see it as though it's in the environment. What you could do is like imagine it in your mind's eye, and then like remember images and pictures you've seen in the past of platypus and so on. But you cannot like manifest one like on top of this table right now and say like, look, there it is. So that shows you that external reality is not subject to your mental control. And that is another basic clear reason to assume that it's real. Because if it wasn't real, then it would just respond to whatever you want to have happen, or the items that you experience and perceive would be subject to your discretion and to your, choice. Now, a third reason that he thinks that's clear and distinct is this. Memories are less vivid than current perception. They're less vivid, less sharp than current perception is. Okay, so look at this. Think back, if you can, to whatever you were doing on New Year's, okay? And then compare that memory to what you're experiencing right now watching this lecture. I argue that your memory of that event, even if you have a very sharp, clear photographic memory, it's not going to be as detailed, sharp, and vivid as this moment is right now. And in the same way, right now this is happening live, so you're experiencing it in this moment. But like say a year from now, you think back to this memory of this meeting and this class, and you're like, wow, what a cool, crazy class, that philosophy class. I remember that. Those memories are going to be nice, I hope, but they're not going to be as detailed and vivid as this is right now. So what explains the loss of clarity over time from when you have the first perception to when you remember it later? The only thing that could explain that is if your original perception is caused by the environment and the objects in it that you perceive with your sense faculties and sense organs. But then later on when you remember it, since you're no longer in the presence of those objects, the mind has to recreate the imagined setting that the memory had in its past. So if the world was not objectively real and everything was just a mental figment of your mind, then there would be no reason to lose vividness and clarity, because both the original perception and the so-called memory you would have later would both just be ideas with no external reality attached to them. So you would not expect for there to be this loss of clarity. The only thing that can explain it is that original perception is when you're in the environment, and the memories that occur later are when your mind is trying to come up with an idea that matches the perception of the environment that you were in before. So that's another reason to think there's an external environment. And the one other clear and distinct perception that he also claims that we can say is certain at the end here is that you have a body. Okay, so another clear and distinct perception is I have a body, and it's my body. And he says this is clear and distinct for 3 reasons also. So I'm just going to close with this. This is clear and distinct because I'll just make short work of that. Number 1, it's clear and distinct because I can control this body with my mind, but not others. So I can control this body with my mind, but not others. Same with, of course, you. You'd read that in the first person. So I can control this body with my mind, but not other bodies. Okay, so obviously, as you guys know, just being a living human, your body responds to your mental decisions, and actions are produced that way. So if I say left hand, let's snap the finger, there it goes, it happens. And I just make my hand do it by thinking. But I can't look at you or anybody else and be like, they're going to snap their fingers and then they do it. I mean, I could ask you to do it, but it would not be the same thing as like I directly control the motor functions of my own arm. So I can control this body, but not others. Isn't that a decently good reason to think that it is mine because I have this special connection to it of control? Another thing is the following. I experience sensations when this body is given a stimuli, but not others. Okay, so if something happens with or to this body, I will be the one that experiences those sensations. So like here, I'm going to pinch my arm a little bit. Kind of hurts a little. Ouch. But you don't feel the pinch because it's not happening to your body. And vice versa. If something goes on with you, you scrape your knee, ouch, it hurts. I might empathize with you and be like, I feel your pain, but that's a metaphor. I don't literally feel your pain. It's not like you hurt your knee and then, ouch, my knee hurts. So that's another reason to think that this body is especially my own, because unlike a person who's riding on a bike, if something happens and the bike gets a flat tire, they don't go, ouch. But if something happens to their foot, they do go, ouch. So that means that that body that they have, which they are experiencing sensations for, is their own. And then the third reason he gives, this is it, is that I cannot remove myself from this body unlike others. Okay, so I'll end with this very quickly. When it comes to every other body in the whole universe, I can go away from it, obviously. That's human bodies and just objects. If I don't want to be anywhere close to this hydro flask, I can go farther and farther away from it. It's pandemic time, social distancing. Everybody get away from me, don't get close to me. So I could distance myself from other things, but I can't distance myself from this thing, me. I'm locked into this body and I can't go away from it. I know people talk about teleportation, astral projection, but you can't depart from your own body. But I can go away from other bodies. So that's another basic reason to think that my consciousness inhabits this body and is somehow specially connected to it. Yeah, so I can't remove myself from this body, and like every other body, I experience sensations when this one's stimulated, but not others. And I can control this body with my mind and thought, but not others. So isn't it therefore pretty clear to say that you do have a body? Notice then that at the end of the meditations, this is the end of his book, he's willing to now say that the things that we doubted for a little while, is there an external world? Do I have a body? Now he says we can actually be trusting in those things. But why can we trust it? Because he thinks God is the guarantor of clear and distinct perceptions. So it's kind of funny, if we did not have the ability to prove God exists, according to Descartes, we would always have to live with these doubts. Is there an external reality? Do I have a body? He thinks it's only the goodness of the benevolent God that will allow us to repose confidence in those things that are most obvious. I don't know if I agree with every element of what he's argued here, but it's an inventive and it's a clever argument, and it's trying to make the case that we have a mind, but also a body. They're connected for now, but at the moment of death, that would be the one exception to this. You might have saw that and said, wait, he says the mind and the body are separate. Yes, but while you're living, they're connected at least. And then according to religion and theology, they do eventually separate at the point of death. Okay, guys, so that's it for today. We've heard Descartes' argument for dualism and some interesting material and content on that. We'll return on Monday next week, and we'll start building up the physicalist monism side of the argument. So we'll see that side on Monday. But for now, I'm letting you guys go. Sorry to keep you for a few extra minutes. Just wanted to be complete if I could. Let me know that everything's fine, and I'll close our stream, and I'll be in touch over the weekend if anyone has emails or anything else. Okay, thanks again, everyone. David, Alicia, Tina, appreciate you guys. All the rest, please keep coming, keep attending. You know, with school, sometimes people lose their focus in the latter stages, but I think you got to sprint to the finish. Don't limp to the finish. You know, this is when it's really important because a lot of the big assignments are at the end. So keep attending, pay attention, try to enjoy it, and I'll see you guys then next week. Okay, have a good one. Bye-bye.